Emma Carter walked into Merrick's Gun and Ammo still in her scrubs, 14 hours into a shift that hadn't technically ended yet. She wanted one thing, a pistol for home defense. Nothing complicated. The two clerks behind the counter looked her up and down before either one said a word. "Something small," one of them said, sliding the cheapest pistol in the case across the counter. "So you don't break a nail." Emma didn't answer. She picked it up, checked the weight, worked the slide once, clean and practiced. Then she looked past him toward the rifles mounted on the wall. "Could I see that AR?" The shop laughed. A customer near the register caught the look on the clerk's face and laughed harder. Something in the kid snapped. "This isn't a toy store, bitch," he said. "Stop wasting our time." Emma didn't move. She didn't argue. She stood there, calm and completely still, watching him the way you watch someone who has no idea what he just did. The front door opened behind her. An older man in a faded Marine Corps cap walked 3 steps into the shop, looked at her face, and stopped completely still. "Before we start, drop protect in the comments if there's someone you'd do anything to keep safe, and hit subscribe." They had no idea who just walked into that shop. Emma Carter had been on shift since 6 that morning, and by the time she pushed through the door of Merrick's Gun and Ammo a little after 8 that evening, she'd been awake for 16 hours and working for 14 of them. Still in the pale blue scrubs she hadn't found a reason to change out of. Her badge clipped crooked to her chest. Her hair pulled back in the kind of loose and practical knot a person makes when they stopped thinking about how they looked hours ago. The bell above the door jingled behind her. She didn't linger by the entrance the way some first-time customers did, taking in the racks of rifles along the back wall, or the glass cases full of handguns arranged like jewelry. She walked straight toward the counter with the specific and unhurried purpose of someone who had already decided exactly what she wanted and had no intention of making the trip take longer than it needed to. She wanted a pistol, something reliable, something for the house, something she could keep in a drawer and hope she'd never once have to reach for. That was the whole of it, nothing more complicated than that. The shop was quiet at that hour, the specific and settled quiet of a small-town gun store on a Tuesday evening. One older man browsing the rifle rack near the back with the patient attention of a regular who wasn't in any hurry, and 2 younger men behind the counter, who straightened up when the bell rang, the way employees straighten up for anyone, though the straightening didn't last long once they actually looked at her. Tyler was 23, wiry, the kind of easy confidence that came from working somewhere he considered himself an expert and rarely had reason to be corrected. Cody was a year younger, quieter, the sort of person who laughed at whatever Tyler laughed at a half-second after Tyler did. Neither of them was cruel by nature. They were simply young enough and comfortable enough behind that counter that a tired woman in hospital scrubs walking in near closing didn't register to either of them as someone who might know exactly what she was asking for. Tyler asked what she was looking for, and Emma told him plainly, a pistol, something dependable, home defense, nothing fancy. He nodded, reached beneath the glass without much thought at all, and slid the cheapest handgun in the case across the counter toward her, the specific and slightly patronizing smile of a man who had made this exact recommendation to a dozen tired-looking women before her. "Something small," he said, glancing at her hands, "so you don't break a nail." Cody laughed at that, quick and automatic, and the older man near the rifle rack glanced over briefly before going back to what he was doing. Emma didn't answer him. She picked up the pistol and turned it over once in her hand, testing the weight the way you test the weight of something you've held 100 times before. And then she racked the slide in one clean and unhurried motion, checked the sights, dropped the empty magazine, and seated it again with the specific and practiced economy of movement that had nothing careless about it at all. Tyler's smile faltered slightly, though he didn't fully register why yet. Emma set the pistol back down on the counter, gently, and looked past him toward the wall of rifles mounted behind the register, her eyes settling on one in particular with the same unhurried attention she'd given the handgun a moment earlier. "Could I see that AR?" she asked. The question landed in the shop with more weight than it should have, and Tyler's expression shifted through something considerably less confident than it had been 30 seconds earlier. He glanced toward the wall, back at Emma, and seemed to be recalculating something about the tired woman in scrubs standing in front of him that his first read hadn't accounted for. A customer near the front of the store. A man Emma hadn't noticed come in, waiting near a display of ammunition, caught the specific hesitation on Tyler's face, and laughed, short and sharp. The particular kind of laugh that costs a man in front of his coworker more than it costs anyone else in the room. Cody snickered too, and something in Tyler's chest tightened at being caught flat-footed by a question he hadn't expected and didn't have a smooth answer ready for. He covered it the only way he knew how, which was to make the moment about her instead of about him. "This isn't a toy store," he said, his voice climbing louder than the shop actually required, sharp enough that it carried past the counter and into the aisles behind him. "Stop wasting our time." Cody, emboldened by his coworker's tone, added something about how maybe she should stick to pepper spray, the two of them laughing again in the specific and ugly way people laugh when they've decided, without much evidence, that the person in front of them isn't worth taking seriously. Emma didn't move. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't reach for her wallet and walk out the way plenty of people would have after being spoken to like that. She simply stood where she was, her hands resting easy on the edge of the counter, her expression carrying nothing that gave either of them the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She watched Tyler the way you watch someone who has just done something they don't yet understand the size of. A calm and total stillness that had nothing performed about it. And something in that stillness made Cody's laughter trail off a few seconds before Tyler's did. An instinct neither of them could have named settling uncomfortably into the quiet that followed. Near the rifle rack, the older man, who had been browsing quietly for the better part of 10 minutes, hadn't looked up during any of it, absorbed in comparing two scopes with the patient attention of a man who had all evening and nowhere else to be. He was in his late 60s, weathered through the hands and the face in the way outdoor work leaves a person. And he'd been coming into Merrick's twice a month, for longer than either of the two clerks behind the counter had worked there. His name was Pete Sawyer, and he had no idea, standing there with a scope in each hand, that the quiet woman near the register was about to become the reason he was still alive by the end of the night. He set one scope down, picked up the other, and kept comparing, entirely unaware of the exchange happening 20 feet away. The front door opened again, the bell above it jingling a second time, and a man walked in, wearing a faded green jacket and a Marine Corps ball cap worn soft at the brim from years of use. He was in his early 70s, broad through the shoulders despite his age, moving with the specific and settled bearing of someone who had spent decades being the person a room organized itself around, without ever needing to raise his voice to make that happen. This was Walt Merrick, the shop's owner, though neither Tyler nor Cody noticed him come in yet, still caught in the aftermath of whatever had just happened at the counter. Walt took 3 steps into his own store, glanced toward the register out of the automatic habit of a man checking on his business, and his eyes landed on the woman standing there in pale blue scrubs, her hair loose from a shift that had clearly run long, her hands still resting easy on the counter's edge. Walt Merrick stopped walking. He stood completely still in the middle of his own shop, staring at a face he hadn't expected to see again in this lifetime, and something in his chest went tight, in a way that had nothing to do with his age, and everything to do with a name he hadn't said out loud in longer than he wanted to think about. Walt crossed the length of his own store without a single glance toward either of the 2 young men behind the counter, moving with the unhurried and total focus of a man who had entirely stopped noticing anything else in the room. Tyler started to say something, the automatic greeting he gave his boss on any ordinary evening, and Walt didn't so much as turn his head. He stopped a few feet from Emma, close enough to see her face clearly under the fluorescent lights, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, the specific and searching attention of a man, confirming something he was afraid to be wrong about, and even more afraid to be right about. "Carter," he said quietly, not a question. "A name spoken the way you speak a name you've turned over in your mind more times than you'd ever admit to anyone. Sergeant Carter." Emma's expression shifted for the first time since she'd walked through the door, a small and involuntary flicker of recognition crossing her face before she brought it back under control. She hadn't been called that in a long time, and hearing it now, in a gun shop in a town she'd only moved to 8 months earlier, hit her with a specific and disorienting weight she hadn't braced herself for. She didn't answer right away. Walt didn't seem to need her to. Tyler, still processing the fact that his boss had walked in and completely ignored him, laughed nervously and tried to smooth over whatever tension he could feel building in the room without fully understanding its source. "You know her, Walt?" he said, forcing lightness into his voice that didn't land anywhere close to where he wanted it to. Walt turned his head slowly and looked at him, and whatever expression was on Walt's face made Tyler's half-formed smile die somewhere in his throat. Walt didn't laugh. He didn't raise his voice either, which somehow made it worse. "I served 2 counties over from her battalion," Walt said, his eyes moving back to Emma. "Before she went to Force Recon. I heard her name plenty of times before I ever met her in person. Didn't expect to meet her like this." He paused, taking in the pistol still sitting on the counter, the specific and careless way it had been slid toward her 20 minutes earlier, and something in his jaw tightened. "You sold Sergeant Carter the bargain bin piece and told her not to break a nail?" If you've ever watched someone get written off by people who had absolutely no idea what they were actually looking at, drop "never judge" in the comments right now, because Tyler and Cody were about to learn exactly how wrong 2 minutes of careless laughter could turn out to be. Cody's face had gone pale somewhere in the middle of Walt's sentence, and Tyler opened his mouth to explain himself and found, for the second time in 10 minutes, that he didn't have anything ready to say. Walt didn't wait for either of them to find their footing. He told them plainly, without theater, exactly who they'd been mocking, that the woman standing at his counter had served with a reputation that had reached him secondhand, years before he ever had reason to know her name attached to a face, that Force Recon wasn't a unit people talked their way into, and that whatever they thought they understood about who deserved to hold a rifle in this shop, they'd had it backward from the moment she walked through that door. He said it evenly, without cruelty, the specific and controlled delivery of a man correcting something rather than punishing someone for it, though the correction landed with considerably more weight than shouting ever could have. Emma stood through all of it without saying much, the particular discomfort of being discussed rather than spoken to, settling over her the way it always did in moments like this one. She wasn't used to being recognized. She'd built the last several years specifically around not being recognized, and something about standing in a gun shop being described in the third person by a man who clearly knew more about her than she'd told a single person in this town felt like a door swinging open she hadn't been ready for. Walt turned back to her, his expression softening slightly, the specific and careful tone of a man choosing his next words with more caution than he usually needed to. "I heard some of what happened to your unit," he said. "Not all of it. Just enough to know it wasn't what people said at first." He hesitated, glancing at her face like he was checking whether he had permission to keep going. The specific and unmistakable pause of someone who understood he was standing at the edge of something that wasn't fully his to talk about. "I heard there was a breach that went bad. I heard." He stopped himself there, the sentence hanging unfinished in the air between them, and Emma felt the entire shop's attention settle onto that pause, without either of them saying another word. It was Pete Sawyer, 20 feet away near the rifle rack, who broke the silence first, though not with anything he meant to say. He made a small sound, low and strange, nothing like a word at all, and the scope he'd been holding slipped out of his hand and clattered against the shelf. Emma's head turned toward the sound before her conscious mind had finished registering what she'd heard, the same automatic reflex that had once made her the fastest set of hands in her platoon, and what she saw across the store stopped the air in her chest completely. Pete had gone down onto one knee, his right hand gripping the shelf edge for balance that wasn't fully working, and the right side of his face had gone slack in a way that made the whole shape of it look wrong, his mouth pulling downward on one side, while he tried, and failed, to say something that came out as nothing but slurred and broken sound. Tyler and Cody both froze completely, the specific and useless paralysis of people encountering an emergency they had no framework for handling, and Walt took a half-step forward with his hands already reaching uselessly toward nothing, his own instincts 30 years out of practice for exactly this kind of crisis. Emma was already moving before either of them had finished processing what they were looking at. She crossed the store in seconds, dropped to Pete's level, and began talking to him in a voice that had none of the quiet reserve she'd carried through the entire encounter at the counter. Clear, fast, and completely certain, the specific and practiced authority of someone whose hands had done this exact assessment 100 times before, in conditions considerably worse than a small-town gun shop. She asked him to smile for her. Half his face didn't move. She asked him to raise both arms. One drifted down before he could hold it level. She told the room, without looking up, exactly what she needed. Someone to call for an ambulance immediately, someone to note the time, someone to stay back and give her room, and the specific and total shift in her voice, from the woman who'd stood silent at that counter 20 minutes earlier, to the person now commanding an emergency, stopped every single person in that store cold. Walt grabbed the shop phone and dialed with hands that weren't entirely steady. Tyler stood frozen near the counter, staring at the same woman he'd told to stop wasting his time less than half an hour ago, now the only person in the building who had any idea what to do. And Emma, kneeling on the floor beside a man she'd never met until this evening, kept talking to Pete in the same low and steady voice, counting the minutes in her head the way she always did, watching the entire shape of the night rearrange itself around a stroke nobody in that room had seen coming. Emma kept Pete talking through every second of the wait, her voice low and unhurried even as her hands moved with fast and total precision, checking his pulse, keeping his head positioned correctly, watching the clock on the wall behind the counter, without ever once looking away from his face. She asked him simple questions. His name, the date, what he'd had for breakfast. Not because the answers mattered, but because keeping his mind engaged mattered. The specific and practiced technique of someone who understood that a person fighting to stay oriented needed something to hold on to, besides the fear closing in around him. Pete's words came out broken and slurred, half of them lost somewhere between his brain and his mouth, but he kept trying, kept looking at her with the specific and desperate trust of a man who had decided, somewhere in the first 30 seconds of this, that the woman kneeling beside him was the only solid thing left in the room. Walt stayed on the phone with dispatch, relaying updates in a voice considerably steadier than his hands, and Tyler hovered a few feet away, holding a stack of folded towels he'd grabbed from somewhere without being asked, useless and desperate to be useful in whatever small way he could manage. Cody had gone to unlock the back entrance for the paramedics, moving fast, glad to have something concrete to do with his hands that wasn't standing frozen near the counter, feeling the specific weight of everything he'd said to the woman currently keeping a man alive on his shop floor. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes after Walt's call, and Emma gave the paramedics her assessment, in the clipped and complete language of someone who had delivered 100 handoffs before this one. Onset time, symptoms observed, the specific side of the body affected, vitals she'd tracked without any equipment, beyond her own hands and her own count. The lead paramedic glanced up at her once, midway through her report, the particular look of a professional, recognizing another professional, in a room that hadn't given them any obvious reason to expect one. They loaded Pete onto the stretcher, and as they wheeled him past her, he reached out with the hand that still fully worked, and gripped her fingers for just a moment, his eyes wet, his mouth still not quite cooperating enough to form the words he was clearly trying to say. Emma squeezed his hand back and told him he'd done everything right, and then the doors closed and the ambulance pulled away, its lights sweeping red and blue across the front window of a shop that had gone almost entirely silent. If you've ever watched someone go from invisible to essential in the space of about 90 seconds, drop "never judge" in the comments right now, because Tyler was about to ask Emma the question he should have asked before any of the rest of this happened. The adrenaline that had carried the last several minutes began to drain out of the room slowly, replaced by the specific and awkward quiet of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the last half hour. Walt set the phone down and exhaled fully for what felt like the first time since he'd walked through his own front door. Cody came back from the rear entrance and stood near the counter without quite knowing where to put himself. Tyler still had the folded towels in his hands, forgotten now, and he looked at Emma with an expression that had shed every trace of the careless confidence he'd been wearing when she first walked in. He set the towels down slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to, the specific and unpracticed sound of someone who didn't apologize often and didn't know quite how to do it smoothly. "For what I said. All of it." Emma looked at him for a moment and told him it was fine, not because it fully was, but because holding on to it wasn't going to change anything about the last 30 minutes, and she had never been someone who wasted energy on grudges that didn't serve a purpose. Tyler nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. And then he asked the question that had clearly been sitting behind everything else since Walt first said her rank out loud. "Can I ask you something?" he said, quieter now, none of his earlier bravado left in his voice at all. "Walt said you were Force Recon. Why'd you leave, if you don't mind me asking?" The question landed in the shop with a different kind of weight than anything that had come before it, and Emma felt the familiar and unwelcome tightening in her chest that always arrived when someone asked her that directly, instead of dancing around it the way most people did, once they sensed there was something underneath the surface. Walt, standing a few feet away, didn't jump in to smooth it over or redirect the conversation, though something in his expression told her he already suspected at least part of the answer. He simply waited, the same patient stillness he'd shown since he first said her name, giving her the room to answer or not answer, without pressure either way. Emma opened her mouth to respond with the short version she'd used 100 times before, the clean and practiced deflection that satisfied most people, and closed the conversation before it went anywhere real. Personal reasons. Time for a change. Wanted something steadier. The words were right there, worn smooth from years of use, and she'd said some version of them to nearly everyone who'd ever asked, including the handful of people in this town who knew she'd served at all. She didn't say them. She stood in the middle of a gun shop with the smell of gun oil and coffee still hanging in the air, a stranger's blood pressure numbers still running through her mind out of pure habit, and something about the last half hour, about Pete's hand gripping hers, about Walt saying her actual rank out loud for the first time in longer than she could remember, about the specific and total exhaustion of holding a version of herself together for years that had never once fully fit, made the practiced deflection feel suddenly, completely inadequate to the moment she was standing in. She looked at Tyler, and then at Walt, and then down at her own hands, steady now, the same hands that had just kept a stranger oriented through the scariest minutes of his life, and had once, years earlier, done considerably less for someone who needed her just as badly. Her mouth opened. The words she'd used 100 times sat right there, ready and familiar. For the first time all day, Emma Carter hesitated. Emma looked at the three of them standing in that small circle of quiet. Tyler with his shoulders finally settled, Walt watching her with the specific patience of a man who understood exactly how much this question could cost, Cody hovering a step behind, still absorbing the last half hour. And she decided, somewhere in the space of that silence, that the practiced version of the answer wasn't going to be the one she gave tonight. She pulled a stool out from behind the counter and sat down on it, not because her legs needed the rest, but because some conversations deserved to be had sitting rather than standing. And she started talking in a voice considerably quieter than the one she'd used to keep Pete oriented 20 minutes earlier. It happened during a breach that had gone wrong before her team ever cleared the doorway, she told them. Intelligence that was supposed to confirm the building empty had been outdated by hours, and the room on the other side of that door held considerably more resistance than anyone had briefed them to expect. Her team took casualties in the first 10 seconds, and Emma had reached 2 of her own people before the fighting fully cleared. One with a wound she could manage, one whose injuries told her, the moment her hands found them, exactly how narrow the window actually was. She made the calls a combat medic makes in situations like that, fast and without the luxury of hesitation, and she got the first man stable enough to move. The second man was Nate Ellery, 24 years old, 3 weeks from rotating home to a fiancé he'd shown Emma a photograph of more times than she could count over the course of that deployment. She worked on him anyway. She worked on him the entire way to extraction. It wasn't enough. Her voice stayed level through most of it, the specific and controlled cadence of someone who had told this story to review boards and investigators enough times that the mechanics of the telling no longer cost her the way the actual memory still did. She told them the review cleared her completely. Every decision documented as correct, given the information available in that room. The outcome determined to be the result of the intelligence failure, rather than anything she had done or failed to do. She said the finding was accurate. She said it plainly, without bitterness. because she had never once doubted that the investigators had gotten the facts right. Then she told them the part that mattered more than the finding ever had. Being cleared on paper had never once reached the part of her that still, on quiet nights, ran the same 60 seconds over and over, checking each decision against some version of events where Nate made it home to that fiancé after all. She told them that carrying something correctly documented as not her fault was its own particular weight, one nobody had prepared her for, and that she had left the Marine Corps 14 months later, not because anyone had told her to, but because she had discovered she could no longer stand in front of a formation and trust the part of herself that made fast decisions under pressure, the way she once had without question. If you have ever carried something that was never technically your fault and still couldn't set down, drop "never judge" in the comments right now. Because what Walt Merrick did next was something Emma Carter had needed for considerably longer than tonight. Walt was quiet for a long moment after she finished, the specific and heavy silence of a man absorbing something he'd only ever heard the edges of secondhand. Then he told her something she hadn't known, something that had apparently been sitting in a file somewhere for years without ever reaching her. A commendation had been drafted for her actions that day, he said, written up by someone in her chain of command who understood exactly what she'd done under conditions that should have made it impossible, and the paperwork had stalled somewhere in the process, the way paperwork sometimes does when the person it concerns has already left the service and there's nobody left pushing it forward. Walt said he still had contacts from his own years in uniform, people who owed him favors he'd never once called in, and he told her plainly that he intended to make a call on her behalf, whether she asked him to or not. Emma didn't say much in response to that. She gave him a small nod, nothing more than that, the specific and understated acknowledgement of someone who had learned a long time ago not to expect much from institutions and didn't quite know what to do with an offer that sounded, for once, like it might actually go somewhere. Walt seemed to understand that the nod was enough. He didn't push for more. Tyler stood a few feet away, quieter than Emma had seen him all evening, and after a moment he asked Walt, almost hesitantly, whether the shop had a standing discount for veterans. Walt told him it did now, effective immediately, and Tyler nodded and crossed to the register without being told to do anything further. He rang up the pistol Emma had originally come in for, along with the AR she'd asked to see and had never gotten the chance to properly look at, and when he finished, he simply told her the total was 0, sliding both cases across the counter without meeting her eyes directly, the specific and quiet way a person makes amends when words alone don't feel like enough. Emma didn't argue with him about it. She had learned, a long time ago, that letting someone make a genuine correction mattered more than insisting on paying full price out of pride. She thanked him, plainly, and gathered both cases, and stood for a moment in the shop that had looked at her one way when she walked in, and an entirely different way now that the evening was ending. She paused at the door before she left, her hand resting on the frame, and looked back at the three of them standing there. Walt already reaching for his phone to make the call he'd promised. Tyler still standing a little straighter than he had all night. Cody watching quietly from behind the counter. She didn't say anything dramatic. She simply told them she hoped nobody else who walked through that door ever had to prove themselves the way she'd had to prove herself tonight, and that the next time someone tired and unremarkable looking came in asking a question, maybe it was worth answering it properly the first time. Then she stepped out into the cool evening air, the bell above the door jingling once behind her, and walked to her car with 2 cases in her hands, and something in her chest, sitting a little differently than it had when she'd walked in 3 hours earlier. Pete Sawyer recovered well over the following weeks. The stroke caught early enough that his doctors credited the fast recognition and the accurate report given to paramedics with meaningfully improving his outcome, and he came back into Merrick's a month later, walking steadily, his speech nearly back to normal, specifically to find Emma's number through Walt and thank her properly over coffee. Walt's phone call went through channels considerably faster than either of them expected, and the commendation that had sat buried for years finally reached the desk of someone with the authority to finish processing it, arriving at Emma's door 8 weeks later in an envelope she opened alone at her kitchen table and read twice before setting it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered most. Months later, a new coworker at the hospital, having heard some fragmented version of a story about a gun shop and a stroke and a commendation that had taken years to arrive, asked Emma directly whether it was true. Emma looked up from the chart she was finishing and told her the plain version, because the plain version had finally, after everything, become one she was willing to say out loud. She said she'd left the Marines carrying something that was never her fault, and had taken her considerably longer than it should have to understand that being cleared and being at peace were two entirely different things, and that some nights she still worked on both. If this story reminded you that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who's already been tested harder than anyone realizes, subscribe and stay with us. Every week we tell another story about the ones who kept going when nobody was watching. We are not finished telling them.